All right, folks, mechanisms of natural selection, or of evolution, sorry, my mistake. Mechanisms of evolution. Natural selection is essentially one of the mechanisms of evolution. So a mechanism, of course, is a system of how something is accomplished, right? In science, we come up with an idea. So, we say, well, I noticed that things fall, so I call it gravity. But of course, I have this idea or this hypothesis. But what I would need to do is to demonstrate the mechanism. How does it work? So I would come up with an idea. I would say, well, there are little leprechauns, little tiny leprechauns all over the air that are invisible, and they push everything down, and that's why things fall. All right? And people would say, okay, interesting idea. Now, the next step would be to find actual evidence of these leprechauns to prove that they exist and that your mechanism makes sense. And so evolution is an idea that, species change over time, essentially. And these are the mechanisms that have been developed and backed up by evidence to show how evolution could work. And so that makes it a valid scientific theory and not just an idea from somebody who's, on drugs or something. The difference between science and just sort of conjecture, philosophy, for instance, the idea of things. Okay, so what are these mechanisms? So the first is the idea of a mutation. And we know what this means. It basically means that gene sequences can be modified. The base sequence, remember cytosine, guanine, adenine, the base sequence in a DNA molecule can be modified by various things in the environment. Radiation, chemicals, all kinds of interactions can modify or change genes, which causes a mutation. So what mutations do, well, we could say random changes in base sequence produce new alleles. Remember, an allele is a form of a gene, right? And so by changing very slightly some of the base sequences in a particular gene, you could have a different allele. And so mutation is how we get new alleles. New alleles are introduced into populations by mutations. Okay? Secondly, we have a concept of what's called gene flow. And this, of course, means that genes can move between, the movement of genes between populations. Genes, or alleles. Technically, when we say alleles and genes, we mean the same thing, right? The movement of alleles between populations. So if you think about a population of wolves here and a population of wolves over here, this particular population will have a certain allele frequency, right? We talked about allele frequencies when we did the marble experiment. Over here, they'll have a different allele frequency. Let's say we'll put some red ones here, and maybe some greens, just to represent different alleles. Well, in this population over here, maybe there are no green alleles. But it's quite possible that a particular animal from this population would move over here and bring with it a green allele and introduce the green allele into the new population through mating. So gene flows between populations through mating, and alleles are transferred throughout the different populations in this manner. Now, related to this, and your textbook calls it a whole different thing, and it sort of is, but I like to put the two together because they both deal with the movement of alleles. Genetic drift, right? And genetic drift is sort of random changes in allele frequencies. Allele frequencies And this is usually caused by chance, by environmental factors. Environmental factors. That says environmental, right? And of course, if you think back to our demonstration we did with the marbles, we talked about the founder effect, and we talked about the bottleneck effect, and so on. The different ways that certain alleles can be selected because the environment changes. So this obviously has an effect on which alleles are available for mating and which alleles get passed on. And so it is important in terms of how species change. And then, of course, the fourth one is good old natural selection, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail now today. So we've already discussed mutations, right? So we've discussed mutations already, so we kind of know what that's about. And we've discussed gene flow and genetic drift, discussed this one, and we've discussed genetic drift because we've done the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, and we did that already. What we haven't addressed in enough detail yet is this concept of natural selection. And so we're going to look at oh, I missed one. There's one more factor. Sorry, I just realized, going too fast. There is a fifth factor, which we're also going to discuss today, and that is non-random mating. In many species, mating is not random. Two things don't just happen by chance to come together and then just mate. Now, while that does happen in many species, like we're talking, single-celled species and things, as we see the progression of sexual reproduction, we see that there's a great deal of selection that can be made. In other words, non-random mating basically means that the individuals get to choose who they're going to mate with. It's not just a random bumping into each other. They don't just find a male and mate. There's a whole selection process, and we're going to discuss that process as well today. So today we're going to look at natural selection and non-random mating in a little more detail, and go through some of the ideas associated with that. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the first one, natural selection. And let's just talk about some of the ways or types, I guess you could say, that natural selection can sort of progress. So what we have here, first I want to show you a population diagram. So I'm going to draw this picture, and I'm going to draw a bell-shaped curve inside of it here. Something like this. This is typically what happens when we compare a trait. So let's compare a size of an organism on this side, and down at the bottom, let's go with the number. Oh, maybe I got this backwards, sorry. Let's put size along here. Let's erase that, and let's put the number of organisms of that size. So up here on this side, it would be the number of organisms. I know that's a hashtag for you, but in my day, that was a sign that means number. So number of organisms. And so what you can see is down here we have very small size, and up here we have very large size, right? What you can see here is that most of the population falls within a certain range of sizes, sort of the middle ground here, this region of the graph. The red line has the highest number in this middle region. We call this the intermediate phenotypic range, right? Phenotype here being size. So when we talk about the phenotype, we're talking about how big you are. You'll notice that there are drastically fewer animals over here on the large end. The number has gone way down. The graph is sunk. And also in the small end. And that makes sense, right? In any population, most of them are going to be within a certain range, and extremely large ones would be rare and extremely small ones would be rare. So this distribution could be drawn for any type of phenotype. Could be hair color, how many have red hair, how many have brown hair, how many are tall, how many are short, how many, whatever, it doesn't matter. And so what natural selection can do is it can shift or move the green bar, the area that becomes the most common. Okay, so the first type of natural selection is what we call stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is very simply an environmental event that sort of selects for the most intermediate of the traits. So if we think about, we think about this here. Here's our graph. Then what this selection would do is it would tend to sort of work against having a very large size or a very small size. The environmental change would favor those who had the most intermediate or the middle ground. It would push the graph inwards like this, and it would cause the population to sort of move towards the most intermediate of the trait, the intermediate heights. It would, in our case, it would wipe out very large and very small, and it would leave behind those that were in the middle, stabilizing. So it pushes the curve towards the middle. Next, we would have what's called a directional selection. And directional selection is an environmental event that pushes the curve towards one end or the other. So what it does is it selects for instance, the largest, and it selects against those who are in the intermediate or lowest. So it pushes the traits towards the large end, right? And you end up with a species that from then on evolves to be much larger. So some environmental event pushes this in one direction or the other, towards one of the extremes. So we could say that this is an environmental event that favors one extreme over the other. Now I've drawn it going towards the big side, but it could just as easily be pushing towards the small end as well. I just gave you one example. So when we have an event that selects or prefers or pushes the graph towards one of the sides, we call that directional selection. Then we can have something called disruptive selection. And disruptive selection is generally when we have a graph showing our population, and this time the event pushes away from the middle towards both of the extremes. So it favors those that are very small or very large in this particular trait, and it tends to not favor those that are in the middle. So this is in other words, the directional sort of, it's pushing or forcing towards the edges of the distribution, looking for it's selecting for those rare, large or small, and it makes our population develop into. You can imagine if I drew on top of this, what would happen is you would tend to get a bulge like this, and then it would drop in the middle, and you would get this. So you can see that the two blue peaks are two different populations that are moving towards very large and very small, right? And eventually, if that continues, that could become significant enough to lead towards the development of an entirely new species, right? But it's definitely a change in the phenotypes of this population. So we could say that favors both extremes. Over the intermediate phenotypes. So essentially, we're just talking about the different ways that natural selection can push or change a population. A stabilizing selection is one that sort of keeps it kind of where it is. If anything gets too big or too small, they end up dying out, and the green bar here represents where the phenotypes tend to stay, where they were most popular or most numerous to begin with. But a directional selection could happen in an extreme environmental event where now there was a very huge advantage for those that were larger or smaller, one of the extremes, and it pushes the curve. So if I were to draw on top of this, the new population curve would be pushed over here. We would start to see larger animals. And the same thing if you went the other way to small. And then you have disruptive, where it pushes to both extremes, and we see sort of a double humped result, where we have a favoring of mostly smaller or mostly larger. So these are the different types of natural selection. Now, the other thing we have to discuss is what we call sexual selection. And this is the idea that mating is not random. Sexual selection means that animals can choose their mate. And typically what we find is that we have males are competing with each other. This is not always the case, but it is a very strong trend, right? Males will compete for the favor of a female. They will engage in some kind of activity to convince a female to pick them. And then, of course, the females will be the ones that make the choices as to who they want to pick. And there are all kinds of examples of sexual selection and how this works. So what I'll do is I'll give you a couple of examples. And what I can do is, after this video, I'll also try and post some links to some YouTube videos where you can actually watch short clips of these actual mating rituals. So, for instance, animals will use all kinds of things. They will use movements, right? Or dances. We call them mating dances. They will use colors and displays. Many birds have very bright colors. A lot of animals, when it's mating season, will change color, and their plumage or their fur or parts of their body will become enlarged and colorful. They use gifts. They bring each other presents, believe it or not, to demonstrate their worthiness. They use music and song. Obviously, birds, right, sing songs to attract mates. I'm going to tell you a story about a couple of these animals that are pretty impressive. And they, for instance, the spider also uses a form of music, which is very interesting. Some spiders, anyway, and etc. They use all kinds of things. And what's interesting is we can find these very things also in the human world. The things that we do when we're ready to attract a mate or to show off our genetic prowess are basically the very same things that happen in the animal world. So there's a very strong connection here between human behavior and animal behavior. So to give you an example, a couple quick examples. There's the swan, which has this enormous long neck. So here's my best rendition of a swan. A swan with a weird goiter. Let's erase that. I don't know where I was going with that. Let's see, Mrs. Swan. She would have a little beak there. And of course, the swan has this enormously long neck, which is kind of ridiculous. A lot of animal morphisms or shapes and behaviors are actually a threat to them. If you're a predator, a nice long neck is very easy to grab a swan or a goose by, isn't it? So it's a danger, but it's worth the risk. So because it's part of the mating ritual. So this is the female swan, and she's sitting here in the water swimming around. Along comes the male swan, and he comes over, and what'll happen is they'll engage in a very elaborate dance. The female will twist her neck, she'll dip down with her beak and splash in the water, and she will make a very specific series of movements. Now the male's job is to sort of imitate the female and show her that he also can perform those same moves. And in many cases, there's a sequence of moves. He has to sort of know, if she does step 1, he has to do step 2. And if she does step 3, then he has to know step 4. And there's this very intense and often quite long sequence of moves. So these swans can do this little dance for hours. And they will twist and rub their necks and move their necks together and splash in the water. And essentially what she's doing is she's testing him. She wants to know if he can get to level 47, right? Because if he can, it implies two things. First of all, it implies that he's the right species to mate with. There's no point mating with a duck or a seagull. That wouldn't work, so it's a waste of time. So animals use these rituals to identify each other as the same species, for one. But then also what we'll call genetic prowess, which means a set of genes that will be useful for the offspring. Mom wants dad to bring good genes to the table, right? So these dances and displays also signify or represent the genetic complement that the male is bringing to the table, and the female is going to pick the most desirable, the ones that she thinks or she feels would be the best for her babies. So this swan dance is very elaborate. Another one is the bighorn sheep. The bighorn sheep. Let's see if I can. They have these enormous, large horns on the top of their heads, right? I can't really draw a bighorn sheep, but something like that. Little thing here. And the males compete with each other. They have these enormous horns, and they will run at each other, and they will collide and bang their heads together and smash their heads together. And of course, what they're doing here is they're using a physical display. This is a physical prowess. They're using. They're basically saying, "Look at how good I am." Whoever's the last one standing, right, or whoever sort of intimidates the other the most. Physical, and I guess we could say intimidation, is what's happening here. I'm trying to impress the females by being the strongest of the bunch. And they will bang their heads together repeatedly and spar with each other in order to attract the females, who would then choose whichever one they felt was the most effective, right? The one that they want. So again, they have a choice based on this display or physical combat. Usually, though, mating rituals are not, they don't hurt anyone. They're mock combat. So it's very much like sporting events in humans. We use sporting events for the same purpose, right? The football players are out on the field, and they're engaging in a rather arbitrary, silly set of behaviors that really doesn't do anything. It's a bunch of arbitrary rules. You run here, I run there, we smash each other together. And, it's very similar to what's happening here with the rams and or the bighorn sheep. And the females are on the sidelines, the cheerleaders, and the females in the stands, and they're cheering them on, and they're beginning to form impressions about these boys out on the field. It's the same idea, right? They're using this exercise to determine which boys are the ones that I might be interested in. There are all kinds of examples of birds. I'll show you some videos of different birds that build nests, and these nests are elaborate structures that are virtually the bowerbird builds this huge network of sticks, and come back. What did I just do there? Sorry. Rats. Now it won't let me go back. Nope. Hang on. Nope. Here we go. I'll go back here. There we are. Sorry. It builds this gigantic sort of sticks all woven together into two little towers like this. These two little towers of sticks. And then the bird sits in the middle and says, he sits in here in the middle and he's like, look at me. Look at this this great nest I've built. And it's kind of a ridiculous nest in terms of being useful, but it attracts the female, right? So here's the bowerbird sitting in the nest. Another bird, I think it's called a weaver finch, if I recall, lives in Africa. And so in Africa, you'll see these trees, these African trees that, they look like something out of the Lion King, and they're kind of flat like this. And what you'll find is hanging from the trees are these elaborate long things like this, which have been woven by the weaver birds. And up close, what they are is, here's a branch of a tree. It's a huge, long, woven tower or hanging pendulum of sticks. And at the very bottom is a hole where the nest is. And what's interesting is all of this seems useless. Why not just build the little nest, right? And what happens is, when you look at the tree, those birds that are able to build the longest ones are the ones that get favored over the others. And so they're building these incredibly long and elaborate displays. The bowerbird, this one here that I was talking about before, will also choose colorful things to put around the nest. Bits of flower, colorful petals. And what's interesting now with humans is it'll go and find very interesting human artifacts that are colorful. There's a video when one of the links I'll try to put up for you, and it's got a blue clothespin and a blue plastic fork that the bird has found, and it's placed around to attract the female. So it's using these ideas of attraction and colors and presentation. So the biggest nest wins, right? The largest nest wins. Another type of bird will, the female will sit, and I forget what this one is called. I want to say some kind of oven bird, but I'm not really sure. I can't remember. Anyway, the female sits in the forest. The male flies in and lands and brings a little stick or nesting material. And the female will inspect it. And if she's happy with it and she thinks this is good for a nest, she'll remain interested in this male. And he will then fly away and fly back, and then he will come back with a little berry. And she'll inspect the berry. And if it's a good berry that can be eaten, then she basically is saying, all right, you know how to build a good nest and you know how to find food. That's very useful, and you must have a good set of genes. If he brings back crappy material that would make a crappy nest, or if he brings back a colored rock instead of a berry or a poisonous berry or something like that, she's liable to say, you don't quite cut it. You don't make the cut. Your genes can't be that good. And she'll walk away. So again, she's choosing or selecting her mate. The last example I'll give you is the spider, which is really fascinating to me. I've seen this happen in real life. It's quite awesome. If you ever have a chance to sort of, creepily stalk spiders mating, it's quite interesting. The female spins her web by, first of all, making a sort of a structure or a framework of these webs. And there's a gland on her abdomen that secretes the webs, but also a gland near it that secretes the sticky goo that makes the web sticky. So she can decide if she wants sticky web or not sticky. So she makes this network not sticky because this is how she will run around on the web and not get stuck. All right? And then she makes this part of the web sticky. And this is to trap the insects and things that come along. And so the idea is that she will sit in the middle of the web, right here. There's Mrs. Spider in the middle. And she will wait for a fly to come along. And when the fly comes along, it will slam into the web, get stuck, and it will start to wiggle and shake, which vibrates the web. And these vibrations travel down the web towards the female where she feels them. And then once she feels the vibration, she rushes out, sticks her fangs in, injects venom, which kills the bug, paralyzes it, and then kills it. And then she wraps it all up in web and hangs it from there, or carries it to her larder, a special place where she stores this stuff, and she waits for it to sort of age a bit. And the venom will slowly digest and turn the insides of the bug into a nice liquid goo, and then later she can go back and stick in her mouth parts and suck out the goo and eat the fly and discard the carcass that's left over. Okay, that's how spiders work. So now, if you are a boy spider and you come along and you have to mate with this spider, here's boy spider. The problem is if you walk out onto this web and wiggle it, she's going to think you're lunch and she's going to run over here and eat you. So the male spider has to have a system or a way to alert the female or let her know that he's coming to mate and he doesn't want to be eaten. So what he does is, I'll draw a little close-up here, is here's that piece of web, right, like this, and here's the female sitting in the middle, waiting. He comes along, and rather than walk out onto the web, he knows that this is the not sticky part. He's smart enough to figure that out at least. And what he does is he reaches out with one of his legs and he grabs this web and he plucks it like a guitar string. And it sends a pattern of vibration through the string. And this pattern that he makes is very specific. He knows, in other words, he knows what song to play. This is music. He's using like a guitar string. He's playing a song on the web that the female can interpret, can hear, or at least feel in the vibrations. And he plays a very specific song that does two things. It says, number one, I'm the right species of spider to mate with you. Because if he's not, he'll play his song and it's the wrong song and she'll just run out and eat him. Oh, vibration, I'll eat him. But if it's the right vibration, it's basically this particular species love song. It will put the female into a sort of a trance. It'll make her sort of feel all relaxed and sort of, trippy. And then what he will do is once he's got her in the trance, he will scoot out along the web. He will insert his two palps, which he inserts into her abdomen to transfer sperm, and quickly pump sperm into her body, which of course wakes her up out of the trance. And she realizes that, hey, I've just been violated here. What's going on? And so she's getting untranced. He runs back out to the edge here and begins to play the song again to calm her back down. And she's thinking, oh, okay, there's my song again. And what'll happen is he'll do this process many, many times. Sometimes he'll do it 10, 12, 15 times. Run in, put her in the trance, run in, transfer sperm, and run out and try to put her back in the trance. Invariably, though, what happens is eventually, after 12 tries or so, the female wises up and she begins to realize that associate this vibration with the fact that she's being violated every time this song plays. And so eventually, when the male runs in on that fateful last time, thinking she's in the trance, she's not really entranced. And so what happens is while he's fertilizing her, she wakes up and she grabs him and wraps him up. Venom, injects venom, wraps him up, and he becomes a meal. But of course, that's okay, because if you're a male spider, after you've passed on your genes through insemination, there's nothing else for you to do. Male spiders don't have Monday night football. They don't have darts at the local pub. They don't really have any activities, and so there's no point to living once you've done your transfer of sperm. So to ensure that your babies survive, what better way than to offer yourself as a final sacrifice of nutrients for the female so that she can eat you. Now she's got a good full belly and she'll have the energy to lay the eggs and have the babies carry on. So we often see that. We often see males after sex, they die or they're eaten by the female. That's not uncommon, especially among insects. So there's an example of using the music or the song, right, in order to choose a mate. And remember, it does two things. It identifies the species, but it also identifies the genetic prowess. And so that is basically what we mean when we talk about sexual selection and natural selection. And so I'll stop this video here, but I will try to post on the LMS a few little links to some of these things that you can actually watch and see them in real time.